Good evening, all of you. I welcome you all to the keynote presentation session of the SANEM International Development Conference, SIDC 2020, on COVID-19 and development challenges. We already had a first session on labor market, which was very successful. Now we are extremely delighted to have with us Professor Dani Rodrik as the keynote speaker of this conference. Professor Dani Rodrik doesn't need any introduction. However, in brief, I thought that I would like to say a few words about him. Professor Dani Rodrik is Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has published widely in the areas of economic development, international economics, and political economy. His current research focuses on employment and economic growth in both developing and advanced economies. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including most recently the Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. Professor Rodrik is currently President-elect of the International Economic Association and co-director of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity Network. His newest book is Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy, published in 2017. He is also the author of Economics Rules, The Rights and Wrongs of the Dismal Sciences, published in 2015, The Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy, 2011, and One Economics, Many Recipes, Globalization, Institutions and Economic Growth, published in 2007. Over to you, Professor Rodrik. We are eagerly waiting to listen to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Selim. It's very good to be with all of you, and good evening to you. I'm going to share my screen so I can move on to my presentation. I want to talk about the world economy and where we are going and what that might imply for both advanced countries as well as developing countries like Bangladesh. I just want to make sure that you do see my presentation.
Yes, I think it's perfectly okay now, Dr. Rodrik.
Great. Okay. So I guess my key theme here is going to be that the world will both be very different, but also in some ways not that different. In a way, everything will be different after COVID-19. But if we sort of take a step back from the immediate crisis and the public health challenge, that what COVID-19 really does is merely exacerbate ongoing problems, ongoing trends, and make it in a way clearer that we have important choices that we face in this fork of the road. In particular, I think both are existing models of globalization and of economic development were, I believe, unsustainable. I think I've called our existing model of globalization a model of hyperglobalization, and I will explain a little bit more about what I mean by that and why I say it was an unsustainable model. And with regard to economic development, I think the prevailing model that we've all had the last 4 or 5 decades of economic growth through integration in the global economy is also one that I think we will need to reconsider because of both external and domestic circumstances. So I think that we will need a new model. So a change in course was, I believe, inevitable. COVID-19 clarifies that maybe more so than it was evident before. And my main argument to you this evening is going to be that rather than trying to mend broken models or return to unsustainable paths, that we should try to begin thinking about alternatives. I think in globalization, we need to imagine a somewhat thinner model of global economic integration, somewhat consistent with the spirit of the Bretton Woods regime. And again, I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in my presentation. I think with regard to growth and development models, I think it's harder to find a precedent to which we can return, because I think it is going to be fundamentally new environment where exports and manufacturing and industrialization aren't really the engine that they have been in the last few decades. And what the implications of that are, I'm actually less certain of. I think we may need to resign ourselves to much lower to moderate rates of growth, lower our ambitions with regard to how much growth we can have. And also, I think we'll need to develop a growth model that's going to be much more focused on the domestic economy, on the middle class, on jobs for ordinary workers, and for social and economic inclusion. Again, it's a theme I'll come back to, although here I have a lot more questions than I have answers. I think the recent experience of Bangladesh fits overall into this story. That along with a number of many other countries, actually, Bangladesh has had a remarkable growth and poverty reduction experience very recently. But I think the problems have been building up. We see it in the fact that urban manufacturing, the RMG sector, is no longer absorbing employment as rapidly as it was. Of course, there is a perennial problem of excessive focus on garments and textiles and very little export diversification. Productivity growth has slowed down in manufacturing, from what I can see. And of course, the state of the world economy post-COVID is likely to present much fewer out-migration opportunities and weaker remittances, which are so important for Bangladesh. So all of that implies that the same challenge, perhaps more so, will be faced by Bangladesh of how do we create good jobs for a very large and predominantly young labor force. As I suggested in my sort of comments earlier, I don't think the growth strategies of the past will work, and that's because of the nature of technological change in manufacturing. A process of what I've called premature deindustrialization, which is affecting even low-income countries like Bangladesh, where manufacturing industries are not really are not nearly as steep an escalator, and are not nearly as broad in terms of being able to absorb a lot of labor as in the successful industrializers of previous decades, so that essentially industrialization runs out of steam much more quickly. And that's even happening in countries like Vietnam, which are sort of relatively recent examples of successful industrialization, but countries that I don't think will reach levels of industrialization like earlier successes like South Korea and Taiwan ever did. So I think the kind of alternatives that we'll need to focus on will have to develop both on the supply and demand side of the economy. Much broader based productivity growth at home that doesn't focus on export champions or on manufacturing, but needs to encompass much of the non-traded services of the economy. That's much harder to do, and we don't really know very well how to achieve rapid broad-based productivity growth in non-tradables and services, urban services. And a parallel set of policies on the demand side in terms of focusing on the middle class and demand and incomes of the middle class, because if this is going to be a domestically driven growth model, broad-based demand will have to come from the middle class. So that's sort of, I think, the broad framework for what the new model might look like, although the details are a little bit fuzzy in my own mind. But let me now sort of go back to some of the major trends that we're experiencing. We of course have a rather sharp decline in the volume of world trade that is due to COVID. But the important thing to notice is that world trade had already begun to slow down significantly before COVID. In fact, since the global financial crisis of 2008, you can see that the trend growth rate of world trade had slowed down. So the blue line is really after 2008 is on a much slower climb than it was before 2008. So this slowing down of global volume of trade has been with us for at least a decade or so. In some of the most phenomenal export champions of the recent past, China, key among them, there's been a remarkable reduction in export orientation. So China's export to GDP ratio has fallen from a peak of about 36% just before the global financial crisis to something more like 20% at present. And so that's like a 16 percentage points drop in the export to GDP ratio, which is really quite remarkable. And that sort of keeping in mind that China was the country that was essentially the engine of hyperglobalization and a very rapid increase in trade since the 1990s. That's actually very important. Global value chains have also started to slow down, and we have increasingly a process of regionalization of supply chains, and they're sort of largely now centered around three countries or groups of countries: China, the United States, and Europe, Western Europe, in particular, Germany. And it's quite likely that for all the reasons that the health pandemic has clarified, that this regionalization of supply chains is going to continue. Now, I think it's important to understand why this retreat from hyperglobalization is taking place. I think it's taking place, I would say, because we've pushed it beyond what the logic of economic globalization can sustain. And I'll give you three essential arguments that about the internal tensions of hyperglobalization, which are exacerbated as we sign more and more trade agreements, and we expect global trade to increase relative to global GDP. One, at the simplest level, is really about the basic economics of specialization, and the tension here is between the gains from specialization versus the gains from productive diversification. The gains from specialization are the standard gains from trade, having to trade according to comparative advantage. That's the logic of Adam Smith and David Ricardo and a lot of economists. That's what Bangladesh has benefited from by being able to use the garment sector as an export engine. But there is a long-term development always requires also a productive diversification, which is a process that's actually different. It's not necessarily antithetical to specialization because one can follow the other, but the logic sits very ill at ease with the logic of specialization. That's where the tension comes. And when you look at the countries that have benefited the most from globalization in a long-term perspective, are those not that countries that have become more specialized over time, but it is countries that have become more diversified over time. That is, that they have leveraged world trade and the world economy to stimulate productive diversification through economic policies. That, of course, was true of Japan in the 50s and 60s, was true of South Korea and Taiwan in the 60s and 70s, has been true in a major way of China since the 1990s. That's sort of, there's always been this balance between specialization and diversification. But the more countries have pushed on global economic integration and trade agreements, the more they have, in some sense, pushed against this constraint of diversification, and they've harmed their economic development potential as a result. In the advanced countries, I think that are already productively diversified, a second tension has come into play, which is a tension of justice, of fairness, of distribution, which is, we know the fundamental logic of gains from trade is that efficiency gains and redistribution are two sides of the same coin. You don't get the gains from trade without a lot of redistribution. That goes all the way back to all the famous theorems of trade suggest that you cannot get the efficiency gains from trade if you're not essentially shuffling a lot of incomes across different factors of production, different regions of the economy. And we've seen this in the advanced countries after the 1990s. As gainers and losers have diverged in their economic fortunes, the political opposition to globalization has increased. That's part of the backlash. Another part of the backlash is an inherent tension between the logic of deep economic integration, which is the logic of regulatory harmonization, reducing barriers to trade by constraining what countries can do behind the border, whether it's their intellectual property rights policies, their industrial policies, their subsidies, their agricultural policies, so forth, that forcing countries to harmonize their regulations, or at least to constrain what can be done with regard to domestic regulations, in order to provide the maximum access to their markets on the part of their trade partners, or to reduce, to the extent possible, the domestic barriers to trade. That logic has hit against the logic of that different countries are different. They have different preferences, they have different values, they have different historical trajectories, they have different developmental or social needs. And that logic calls for regulatory diversity. That is, each country having their own investment rules, or their different intellectual property rights, or different industrial policy regimes, and so forth. And I think the political or accountability tension has arisen from sort of the logic of deep integration, trade agreements, and financial globalization, increasingly constraining what countries could do domestically in terms of their domestic agenda, and that's created a deep political tension. This is a problem that's endemic in globalization. I like to go back to the history of an earlier era of globalization, the gold standard of the late 19th century. And it's interesting that at the height of the gold standard, very different kind of globalization, we saw a very similar kind of political backlash to the gold standard. And that was probably best expressed by the American politician, William Jennings Bryan, who ran for the presidency in 1896 in the United States as the candidate of the populists. Populism was a big thing back then too, and it was in fact driven precisely from the economic grievances that were created by the global economy. That under the gold standard, essentially all international price pressures were transmitted to the domestic economy with very little room for domestic monetary and fiscal policy to be able to adjust that. So what that meant late in the in the 1880s and early 1890s in the United States was that commodity prices were declining, agricultural prices were declining in the United States in line with the rest of the world. Because of a shortage of gold, money and credit conditions were very tight. That meant that the nominal interest rates were actually high. So the farmers were facing very high real interest rates on their debts. And that was the genesis of the People's Party, or the American populists of the late 19th century. And their spokesman, William Jennings Bryan, says it very well here. He says, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." That is to say, you're not going to subjugate the needs of ordinary people. Then it was farmers. Today it's workers and communities in heavily impacted parts of advanced countries. You will not subjugate their needs to the requirements of the global economy. And when you do that, you're going to necessarily run into this political problem. I think going back to the history of globalization and the populist backlash of a very an earlier era is also a useful reminder for us that that globalization is not just one thing, that there are different globalizations that are possible. And let me illustrate that by referring to three different models of globalization. Those are the rows here. I talked a little bit about the gold standard. I talked a little bit about the post-1990 hyperglobalization. But of course, there was also a different type of globalization in between, which is that, if you will, the 3 or 4 decades of the Bretton Woods period after the Second World War. And we can distinguish these 3 different types of globalization along 5 different questions. So one question, looking at each one of the columns here, is the degree to which capital mobility is an aspiration, the degree to which free trade in goods is an aspiration, the degree to which labor mobility is an aspiration, the degree to which the rules of globalization, either written into explicit agreements or informal, whether those rules actually reach behind borders and constrain what domestic policymakers can do, not just at the border, but also with respect to their domestic economic policies. And finally, with respect to whether there are formal multilateral governance institutions or not. And interestingly, I think what is a feature of today's globalization that was shared by the gold standard experience that I've just talked about is that they were both types of globalization where, in fact, the world economy reached very much behind the border in constraining and restraining how domestic policymakers could adjust their domestic policies. Now, under the gold standard, it was largely about constraints on monetary and credit policy. So it was impossible to reflate the economy, to lower interest rates without having to go off the gold standard because of the requirement that you had to have a fixed parity vis-a-vis gold, and you had to have free capital mobility. The two of them meant that essentially your monetary policy was tied to global credit conditions and the global supply of gold. Today, it's much broader. As I mentioned, the range of policies which are effectively constrained by the rules of the world economy are much broader, driven both by the nature of trade agreements, by the requirements of financial globalization, free flow of capital, but as well cognitively by sort of the rules that policymakers have internalized about what kind of policies are acceptable and what kind of policies are not. Now, the Bretton Woods regime was an intermediate model of globalization where, in fact, the rules were very much constrained to be only the policies at the border. So it was mostly really about tariffs and to some extent quantitative restrictions on imports. But beyond that, countries were relatively free to do whatever they wanted with respect to their industrial policies, their domestic subsidies, their intellectual property rights. Services were completely unencumbered. Agricultural policies were completely free, and so forth. Now, the interesting paradox about the Bretton Woods regime was that even though it was a kind of a very thin model of globalization, where the rules really constrain only tariff and quota policies at the border and didn't really reach behind into domestic policies, it's really remarkable how much increase in world trade and long-term investment we got under the Bretton Woods regime, even though it was a very thin kind of a globalization. So, if we compare the expansion of world trade, world GDP in the Bretton Woods period with what we've had under hyperglobalization, you might be surprised to learn that in fact world trade expanded more rapidly under the Bretton Woods regime than it has in the period since 1990. And you should note that I'm starting the Bretton Woods period here from 1950, not 1944, 1945, because that would be, I'm excluding the immediate rebound in world trade in the initial years of the post-Second World War period. But even if we focus on the post 4 decades after the 1950, it was remarkable how rapidly world trade expanded. So the point here is that if we want a healthy world economy, measured by expansion of world trade, world GDP, it's not at all clear that in fact more trade agreements, more and more requirement that countries be open to capital flows, more financial globalization, more constraining rules that prioritize the world economy, the needs of global trade and integration over the needs of domestic inclusion, domestic economic and social prosperity. That it's not at all clear that those rules, in fact, work to expand global trade and investment. In fact, probably the best thing we can do to return the world economy to health would be to provide countries with greater room to solve their domestic problems. And that would be largely about reconstituting social bargains in the advanced countries and allowing developing countries to re-engineer their growth and development models, as I'll come back to. So I think as I look into the future, I think there is a sort of a good scenario for the future of globalization that it has, with lower ambitions with respect to how much financial globalization or how deep trading integration or how extensive trade agreements we want to sign. It's a kind of a globalization that's much more in line with the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, where we emphasize the domestic agenda. So for developed countries, that's going to be largely revolve around the priority of reconstituting social contracts at home. That's going to entail a range of tax, social, environmental innovation, labor market policies that support both a green and also a good jobs economy at home. And trade policy, globalization policies essentially become an adjunct to those requirements rather than the other way around. So it would be perfectly okay for advanced countries to protect their domestic economic and social policies through policies at the border in order to prevent regulatory arbitrage. So this might mean, for example, that you might have carbon border taxes, you might manage capital flows, you might place some restrictions on foreign investment, you might countervail against social dumping, to the extent that international trade or inward investment might undermine the integrity of your national security, your domestic technological systems, your domestic labor market policies and social policies, your decarbonization policies at home, and so forth. The parallel for the developing countries is the priority to reconstitute development strategies, and that's going to be industrial investment policies to support economic transformation at home. I'll come back to that in a little bit. That doesn't mean that we move away from global governance. We still need multilateral institutions. But I think what I would say is that we need multilateral or global governance where the gains from global economic institutions, where the gains from global governance are actually demonstrably large. And there are some areas where I would say that is the case, would be fundamentally two non-economic areas of climate change and global public health. Those are the two main areas where we need much more global public goods than our existing arrangements provide. Secondly, I would say that we can do in the economic domain, we can do much better on international tax coordination or coordination on tax havens. So there are areas where there are large returns to international and multilateral cooperation. I think most sort of the kinds of things that we mostly are concerned with when we talk about financial globalization or trade agreements actually are not among those areas. So this would require a substantial shift in the kinds of things that we focus on. Well, what about China? I think how the new global order deals or accommodates China is the most important question that the global economy confronts at the moment. I don't think that either deep economic integration with China or complete decoupling is going to be possible. The alternative is what I've called a model of, peaceful economic coexistence, and that's sort of is moving away from, the unrealized expectation of the WTO that China would eventually become much more an economy along Western market lines. I don't think that's going to happen. So that means that, that we need to move to a conception of international economic arrangements that's much closer to the GATT or Bretton Woods understanding, where we would not be asking other countries to look more like us or to have their domestic economic policies be driven with the overarching goal of providing market access. So that means that China would be allowed to maintain its industrial policies, its subsidies, its large component of state-owned enterprises and so forth, while as a quid pro quo, the rest of the world and the advanced countries in particular would be free to uphold their social standards and technological systems. So the quid pro quo is you can run your own industrial policies, but we have our own social standards and technological requirements or national security requirements that we don't want to be undermined by Chinese imports or Chinese investments. I do think that just as in the case of the GATT regime, such an understanding would allow both sides to reap the bulk of the gains from trade, while at the same time it would leave countries the space with which they can maintain or develop their own distinct economic and social systems. Of course, that's not the only possible scenario. The good scenario, as I said, is a kind of a balancing between the national and the global that can reestablish domestic social bargains and a healthy world economy. But there are at least two other scenarios that I've called the bad or the ugly. The bad would be a kind of a complete collapse of global trade, a descent into trade wars and autarky, as in the 1930s. I don't think that's likely. The world is too globally integrated right now. The cost of complete autarky would be overwhelming. But I do think that the ugly scenario, which is sort of a, continuation of the path that we've been on, with ups and downs of, continued trade tensions, periodic trade wars, sort of, escalating conflict with China, sort of at low level. I think that's certainly a likely scenario as well, even though I've said that obviously there's also a good scenario that we should keep ourselves anchored on, because there is an alternative to simply going back to the status quo ante. Let me say a few words now, turning to development policies or growth policies, particularly in the context of low-income or developing countries. The last few decades have, prior to COVID, have been good for developing countries, and Bangladesh, I think, is an example of that success story. Up until the early 1990s, actually, the rich world, the advanced countries of the world, were growing more rapidly than the developing world. And since the 1990s, that has been reversed. So now we actually do have some economic convergence, although it's not very rapid outside a few countries. Much of that, of course, the rise in that orange trend line here is due to China and a few other Asian countries, a little bit to of course, India. But it was broad-based. Of course, as I said, Bangladesh was part of this. Many low-income sub-Saharan African countries have done much better, returning back to growth levels of early post-independence years, if not much higher. We've had, growth champions like Ethiopia and Rwanda in sub-Saharan Africa, and then Latin America also returned to sort of moderate growth in the last couple of decades. Now, there's been something, if you will look at the growth experience of developing countries in the last two decades or so, there's been a feature of this growth which is very different from traditional growth models. And that's sort of the basis of my argument that this was a growth model for many countries, not all, but for many countries that was actually not going to be very sustainable. So the traditional growth model, which all rapidly growing countries that have converged in a sustained fashion with the advanced countries of the world, is largely this, that it sort of, in the traditional growth model, we have resources, and of course the most important resource that developing countries have are people, workers, labor, moving out of subsistence or informal, very low productivity agriculture into urban manufacturing, particularly organized factories in manufacturing. And manufacturing sort of is this incredible escalator that could traditionally absorb a lot of low-skilled labor. So you could take a farmer in the countryside, turn him or her into a production worker in manufacturing, and productivity would triple or double, triple, or even quadruple because the skill requirements of working in very low skill, say garment factories, was so low. And then over time, of course, then countries develop when they reach upper middle income level, and the industrialization begins to set in, and then we move into sort of productive services, and the country becomes dominated by sort of activities in the tertiary sector. So that's the traditional model of development. If we look at countries that have grown very rapidly in the last decade, Bangladesh is a slight, but only slight exception to this, and I believe that I think this new model is increasingly taking root in Bangladesh as well. But I'd be curious about your comments on that. But what's going on today is largely that even though there is people are moving out of the countryside and they are moving out of agriculture, they're flooding into the urban areas. The traditional industrialization is not taking place. That is to say that most of the employment that is being generated in the urban areas, actually the bulk of it is actually first in services. And secondly, it's not in formal high productivity services, but it is really in very informal, petty or low productivity services. So that's the nature of that sort of big, thick arrow. And the movement into formal manufacturing remains rather slow and unimpressive. And again, Bangladesh is a country that has done better than many others because of the success of the ready-made garments sector. So it has sustained significant amount of employment, export-oriented. But even in manufacturing, the role of sort of the informal, very low productivity manufacturing services, it seems to be increasing recently. The key is that the kind of sort of the movement in towards formal, organized manufacturing in a sustained way is not taking place. So if sort of in the traditional organized factory-based manufacturing has not driven growth, and sort of a chief example of this would be India. And the question is, where has actually growth come from? Growth has come from diverse sources, but in almost all of these cases, there's been much more sort of demand-led growth, and because of that, it's actually has been essentially unsustainable. So where is the demand push coming from? In some cases, it has been terms of trade improvements, resource from in the countries that are exporting resources. It has been, in some cases, it has been because of increased transfers of aids or other resources from abroad. In some cases, it's been an increase in public investment, as in the case of Ethiopia. Or sometimes it has been, some kind of an animal spirits driven increase in private spending and private investment. And I think actually India is a good example of that last pattern, where there's been a very significant increase in the private investment ratio in India. Until recently, of course. And of course, India was a good example of the unsustainability of this path, because growth had substantially begun to come down prior to COVID, because it's, the kind of bootstrapped growth driven by an increase in animal spirit and an increase in private investment can be sustained for only so much. The pattern of structural change that was associated with increase in private investment was largely driven by what was happening in non-traded domestic sectors and non-manufacturing. So people were coming out of farms, but they were taking sort of non-farm jobs that were largely in construction or domestic services, not in manufacturing or industrialization. And that that kind of structural change, which is largely driven by construction, by domestic services, can drive growth and add to the investment push for some time. But because you don't have the productivity dynamic in those sectors, in those in domestic sectors as you do in manufacturing, the growth eventually peters off because of poor productivity performance after a while. This is very much also what has happened in the better performing countries in Latin America. Now these are mostly middle income countries at a different level, different stage of their development. But what's striking here is how poor productivity performance has been. So it's you can see the light blue bar for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru is remarkable, that actually TFP growth since 1990s, I believe. The TFP growth in these countries, in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, has actually been negative. But very, very small and positive in Argentina and Peru. What is that signifying? It's just signifying that essentially the worst performing parts of the economy, the very low productivity, informal domestic services, petty non-tradable activities, those are the parts of the economy that are really expanding. And the much more productive, the globally integrated parts of each one of these economies remain very small and are not absorbing much resources. So that's a kind of the dualization of these economies, even at middle income levels. So the essential problem is that the advanced sectors, the productive sectors, are increasingly skill and capital intensive. They're not labor absorbing. In manufacturing, this problem shows itself as a phenomenon of premature deindustrialization, countries beginning to deindustrialize at very low levels of income. Global value chains and getting yourself into supply chains works for a while, but they remain islands and they don't absorb a lot of labor. If you're successful with tradable services, as countries like India or the Philippines have been, these are IT services or business processing services. These end up being very highly skill intensive, so they are very ill-suited to the kind of labor endowment that those countries have. And even when you have, as in many Latin America countries, you've had successes with non-traditional agricultural exports, whether it's soybeans or it is avocados and asparagus. These end up being sort of relatively high-tech, capital-intensive sectors, and they are, agriculture continues to release labor rather than absorb. Okay, and finally, of course, COVID-19 has only made this problem of dualization of productive structures worse, because it has exacerbated the divide between skilled part of the labor force that can perform jobs remotely and the service sector, where only the sort of the lowest skill can perform those jobs, and those have been demand for those have been shrinking. So that essentially raises the question: is where will the jobs in the middle come from? Where will the middle jobs come from? In some way, I think this is the fundamental existential problem that developing countries face, as well as actually advanced countries face today. It's a universal problem everywhere. And the populist response is a kind of in a way, a symptom of the disappearance of jobs in the middle of the labor market and of this the middle class squeeze. Now, I've already gone too long. I'm not going to talk too much about sort of why our fundamental, our sort of received approach about kind of the welfare state approach to dealing with jobs and social security is inadequate to our current challenges, because the disappearance of these jobs in the middle of the distribution is much more of a structural phenomenon driven by technological change, by the pressures of globalization, and that it will in fact require different types of policies, what I've called sort of good jobs policies. And these good jobs policies will have to be fundamentally more focused on production oriented instead of simply income transfers or investment simply on education, because simply investing in education skills doesn't guarantee that the jobs are going to be there. So you need to work with firms actively to increase the supply of good jobs. And that means a much more sort of hands-on or collaborative approach to the productive sector that's very different from the traditional economist approach of sort of hands-off. You just establish some ground rules and let the private sector take off. I would say that I think this is going to require much more hands-on collaborative state market or government business interactions. And we'll need to think, although this is really a challenge that low-income countries can't really do much about, but it's a big challenge for advanced countries, is to reorient technological change and innovation in a way that's much more adapted or targeted to the distribution of skills that exists, rather than simply expecting that workers and their training will adjust to the requirements of technology. It's really striking to me how the discussion on the labor market consequences of automation, technology, and digitization, all of that, revolves around the question of what do we need to do to make sure that workers have the skills they need, and instead of also asking the question, how should we direct AI and our investments in different paths of technology and innovation in ways that can augment and help the workers that already exist, because it's going to be generations' work to get them to get educated and trained in the way that even by the time it's done, it's probably technology will have greatly moved on. So let me conclude. I think there's a kind of a global challenge, and in my presentation, you've heard me go back and forth between advanced countries and developing countries or low-income countries, because I do believe that this is a global challenge, that this deepening economic dualism, this increasingly stark divide between technologically advanced and globally integrated parts of an economy and the lagging firm sectors and regions. This, of course, in a country like Bangladesh, it exhibits itself in the form of a divide between the successful exporters and a very large informal set of producers. That's the source of the inequality and economic insecurity within countries. That's the source of the backlash against hyperglobalization. It's the source of the slowing down of the growth engine, which I think is going to afflict countries like Bangladesh increasingly. So I think we need sort of the recalibration that we need is going to be multidimensional. We need more capable and nimble governments that's going to be able to generate those productive strategies I've very quickly sketched. We'll need to sort of de-emphasize hyperglobalization because I think the action will be largely domestic within nation states. And our model of growth needs to move away from this export-oriented industrialization model, the model that's served us very well to date, but is no longer really working. And that will require alternative development models that is much more sort of domestically focused on the middle of the skill distribution. So there's a lot of stuff I've thrown at you, and there's a lot more questions that I have answers for. But let me just stop here, and would be very happy to hear your comments, reactions, in particular with respect to the Bangladesh context.
Thank you, Professor Dani Rodrik. It was an excellent presentation, no doubt, and I think very provocative too in certain areas, of which I'm quite sure that it will, we'll actually hear many questions, which will definitely enrich discussion. You talked about the model of globalization on the growth strategies of countries, and then you took Bangladesh as an example. And also to add that probably there is a kind of growth obsession in even we in the developing countries, and sitting in Bangladesh, probably we also face this kind of obsession. And then where without actually not taking much into account the structural change aspect. You talked about global value chain and regional value chain, and also this very interesting elaboration on the hyper globalization. And then the distribution of gains and the kind of difference between the relying extremely on or very much on the comparative advantage, or on the other side of the productive diversification. I think it's an extremely important point you raised. Also on the very interestingly you elaborate on the political economy of the globalization issues. So I think your point on the multilateralism, on the WTO, and these are extremely important and provocative and very interesting. And towards the end, where you actually talked about how we, there is a need for diverting from the export-oriented growth model to more domestic economy-focused growth model. I think that will also generate a lot of discussion and questions. Many thanks, Professor Rodrik. Actually, in the participant list, I can see there are many people who would like to actually talk and intervene. So here I first request Professor Ravi Srivastava from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'll just unmute him just in a second. Professor Ravi Srivastava, if you could, yes.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Salim. Thank you, Professor Rodrik. It was, as always, it's extremely enriching to both read you and now, thanks to the pandemic, also to be able to hear you more often than it was possible to do this before. And it will take a long time to actually absorb all the things that you've been able to bring out in one lecture. But I just have a question that if one looks at what you're advocating or the broad sort of policy contours that you're talking about, how much are this in sync with the political economy realities of today? And particularly if you look at this from the perspective of both national and global capital and global finance. I look at it from the vantage point of view of India, uh, and I find that it will the the both the political class and the capitalist class. I mean, a lot of what you say will entail actually redistributive policies. To put it very simply, and it will indicate a very different model of redistribution and growth than what has occurred in the last 15 to 20 years. And will there be ever, can that possibly be taken up by both the political class and capital? So, and this is a question also for the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Srivastava. Professor Rodrik, it's your choice. How do you like to take up these questions? A couple of or three questions, and then we go to another round. It's your choice.
Let me take this because I think it's an important question, and we might maybe discuss more. But so I think, I mean, to put it, crassly, I think the question is how do you get the capitalist class or firms or big employers to essentially buy into policies that might not be in their short-term narrow interest, given the political influence that they have. And so I think first I would say that I'm not so sure I would put that much emphasis on redistribution. I put much more emphasis on creating good jobs. I think the best way to increase incomes at the low and the middle part of the income distribution is to give people meaningful, rewarding jobs where they can be productive. And I think we're going to achieve relatively little by simply tax and transfer policies or better safety nets or UBI or so I'm not a big fan of sort of purely redistributive policies unless we are doing things that are dealing much more with the structure of the economy, that is the structure of what we're producing, the decisions of firms with respect to what kind of technologies they employ, how many people they hire, where they produce, and things of that kind. Now, in some sense, I've made the problem even harder for myself because by saying that it's not even just taxes, you just have to get firms to pay attention to creating good jobs, and that requires some kind of industrial policy. So the fundamental question is first at the level of ideas and because I think that power rarely is exerted through sheer power. Today, you can't get the government to do something simply by saying, I'm the one who's paying for your political campaigns. I'm much more powerful. You have to do what I'm telling you to do. You have to say, this is a good policy because look, there are so many good economists or lawyers or technocrats who think it's a good policy. So you need to also win the battle of ideas and win sort of the narratives. So one area where the ideational battle has been won, even though the policies still have to follow up, is, for example, in the area of environmental externalities. So with respect to climate change or local environmental externalities, everybody understands that firms left to their own will produce too many negative externalities. And therefore, it's completely appropriate for governments to have policies to ensure that those environmental externalities, whether it's local or climate change externalities, are internalized by firms. So that there we have made this cognitive leap to understand why firms left to their own are not going to be doing the socially appropriate decisions. Now, when I'm talking about good jobs and good employment opportunities, it's exactly analogous, because left to their own, firms will not undertake the right employment, technology adoption, and investment decisions that are socially desirable in the sense of creating good jobs. Because when good jobs disappear, local communities and country as a whole suffer a whole range of economic and social malfunctions. So they are of the same, very different kind of a negative externality, but also a huge negative externality. So the first thing is to win the battle of ideas at the level of, so the narrative has to be that it's important for the government to engage the private sector and the firms to get them to internalize this negative externality. And the second, now, to some extent, when firms, large firms in the global economy are talking about things like corporate social responsibility, paying attention to stakeholders and so forth, it shows a reflection that there is a kind of an understanding that if they can continue business as usual, they have to pay some attention beyond environment and climate to some of these other labor market and social concerns as well. So what we need now is for the governments to become much more proactive in developing the kinds of tools and collaborative mechanisms where they can engage the private sector to pay particular attention on the employment dimension of their decisions. Now, and the reason why this can be done in a way that's not just arm twisting, it's not just through penalties and punishments and enforcement, which would make it very hard, but also in ways that can be also profitable for the government, for the firms, is because these can be productivity enhancing interventions. So when you engage firms in a range of policies that say, look, I'm going to be providing you with the kinds of public input, public goods, training services that are going to make your workers and your operations more profitable, more productive. In return, you're going to engage in investment, employment, innovations decisions to ensure that not just productivity goes up, but goes up also at the same time as with employment going up too. So you engage in formal or informal quid pro quos with the private sector. But that's sustainable bargain, because in return, you're also providing firms with a set of services that is conducive to their ability to increase their productivity. So it doesn't have to be a kind of a confrontational thing. Just like sort of good industrial policy, it could be done in a way that's actually benefits socially responsible collaborative firms as well. So how to get onto a path like this is the real question. But so I would say that this is, first, let's get our ideas straight. And second, let's put in place certain set of practices which can take us along down this path, where an increasing number of firms can see that this is something that is good, not just for the local community and for the local economy, but it can also be good for them because they are simultaneously able to increase their productivity and their capabilities as well.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. Actually, the next set of questions are coming for you. I will actually I'll request Dr. Jayadi Sattar to talk. But before that, I can see a question in the chat box by Professor Nisha Srivastava. And she asked, do you think personalities play a role in the current phase of deglobalization? More specifically, do you think if it had been someone other than Trump, the trajectory would have been the same? So, Professor Rodrik, you can start answering to this question. And the next speaker would be Dr. Jayadi Sattar.
Yeah, I really think that Trump is more a symptom than a cause of this. I mean, I think that the backlash against hyperglobalization has been actually quite widespread around the advanced countries, and it has in the EU, it takes the form of Brexit. It takes in the form of opposition to Brussels and the European Central Bank. So so those trends were already there, and I think Trump is just, if you will, a kind of an extreme version of this backlash. Also, in terms of the trade war against China, which Trump has championed, I think it was certainly coming. I mean, again, Trump does this in a in a particularly ugly and unproductive way, but there's no question in my mind that there was a kind of the unrealistic nature of the implicit bargain of allowing China into the WTO, which was that advanced countries would remain essentially very open to China, and that China would in return play world trade by rules that were very different from how it had played rules, and actually had lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty as a result, that China would suddenly become a different kind of economy. That was an unrealistic expectation and was an unsustainable bargain. So that was going to come apart one way or another. So again, I believe Trump is just a symptom of this and not a cause.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. I'll request Dr. Jayadi Sattar to speak now, and the next speaker would be Professor Kunal Sen. Dr. Jayadi Sattar, please.
Thank you, Salim, and thank you, SANEM, for this excellent international conference. And thank you, Professor.
Very briefly. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Professor Rodrik, for the deep insights. We always have to read and see what you write and what you think before we can go about writing anything on trade policy. I just you provided very deep insights on global challenges. And if I could bring you down to sort of in Bangladesh and give you a particular challenge in the Bangladesh context. The outside observers all recognize that Bangladesh has done very well. We have succeeded in the ready-made garment industry. We are now number 2 in the world. That is because, if I could put it this way, it's a trade policy dualism that Bangladesh has been practicing. And we've created a sort of a free trade enclave for the ready-made garment industry, and it has succeeded. Now, as you point out in your very first slide, we've got a problem of diversification of our exports, and that is the big challenge. And one of the problems is that when it comes to non-garment exports in the manufacturing industry, we still have the age-old problem of protection. We've got very high protection structure, and as a result, it is causing a disincentive for exports. So the unique challenge in Bangladesh is how to get the non-garment exports up so that we can diversify our export basket. And that is not happening because we've got a serious disincentive for exports, because the domestic market, which is highly protected, is far more profitable. And the high tariffs are working as very high subsidies to the non-garment products. So this policy dualism is Bangladesh's, I think, biggest trade policy challenge. And I wonder what you think about it, how you address this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sattar, for that question. Of course, I'm not very well informed about the particularities of the trade policy there. But I mean, it is true that high levels of this indiscriminate trade protection would tend to bias firms away from exports and towards the domestic market. I'm generally agnostic about the value of low to moderate rates of protection. I think the question for me always is there something worth protecting at home? And if there is, then some protection might be okay. But I think what a lot of countries, and possibly Bangladesh have done is use protection as a kind of as a magic wand, and sort of hoping that all you do is you create some protection, and then the domestic capabilities will arise endogenously. And that doesn't happen. So if you're doing something to nurture some domestic capabilities, but nurturing those abilities requires certain period of temporary protection to give yourself a breathing room. Protection might be okay, but that's a very different kind of protection. It's a protection that's tied in with a domestic strategy of achieving diversification or achieving increased domestic productive capabilities. So I would, the question about trade policy for me always has to be reversed. Let's not start from what should our trade policy be. Let's start from what should our domestic productive and investment policy be, and see to what extent our trade policy can help. Often it'll be just make sure that they can get their inputs relatively cheaply. So make sure you don't, put too high tariffs or restrictions on intermediate inputs. Sometimes it might be, there is something good happening here. Let's give them a chance for 5 years, and maybe having our consumers pay a higher domestic price may not be too bad a price to pay for developing new domestic lines of production. Sometimes it might be that for political reasons, you cannot remove the protection, but you might have other mechanisms that you might have. You might be able to subsidize them. So, for example, classic case of South Korea had very high levels of protection in the 60s and 70s, but the way that firms were pushed to export was through export subsidies to essentially give them an incentive So there are many instruments, and there also, I think we need good diagnostic of whether, in fact, the reason we don't have sufficient diversification is mainly due to high levels of protection, or it might be, other problems. It might be, I tell my students the story of how the ready-made garment sector took off in Bangladesh, and through the creation of the firm Desh and the role of Daewoo. So my understanding of how RMG started, or the whole garment sector started, was really a kind of total by chance, because essentially Daewoo had to do something to invest domestically, and they said, okay, we have some experience in garments, let's train some Bangladeshi workers and see if we can make it work in garments, and then it takes off. One wonders how many other such sectors could have taken off by serendipity, and it was just. But if it is a story like that, a question of serendipity, then you need actually a more active government policy to push entrepreneurs to invest in high-risk sectors where they don't know if it's going to be the next RMG or not. And if they succeed, the whole industry will be spawned. If they fail, they will fail miserably. So that's like another classic case of an externality where the government really wants to be able to subsidize entry in order to make sure that you find your next serendipitous discoveries in new sectors. But that's a very different kind of answer than simply reducing protection. So I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just saying that we need a better kind of a diagnostic as to what's holding this off.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. We'll move to Professor Kunal Sen. Before I invite him, I will take the one question from Dr. Pushpa Sharma. He's the Executive Director of Sauti, a think tank in Nepal. And he asked the question, why did the world enter into hyperglobalization from Bretton Woods globalization? And what is the basis that the world could return to Bretton Woods type globalization again? So, and I will also unmute Professor Kunal Sen. So if you, Professor Rodrik, if you can answer to this globalization question, and then we'll get Professor Kunal Sen on board.
Yeah, I think all major transformations, I think, are the joint product of changing of ideas and power. I think on the ideas front, I think what happened was that after the 1980s, we had sort of ideas about the nature of markets changed significantly, the nature of trade. So we went from what was called the Keynesian consensus that paid in the welfare state, which and developmental models that were much more state-driven, where the presumption was that you needed the government to drive markets. After the 1980s, the conception of economic policy became very different, where it had to be that the markets were driving what governments can do. So basically international arbitrage, international market forces to discipline governments became a kind of a good thing. So this, and I think so that was I think the transformation of ideas in the technocracy. In terms of power, I think it's very clearly that we had the fundamental interest groups that drove the process of hyperglobalization, whether it was pharmaceutical companies, tech companies, big banks, multinational corporations. They became the drivers of the process after the 1990s, whereas before them, they were essentially much more on the defensive. So I think there was a fundamental transformation in the agenda of trade and financial policy making, where I think these groups became much more powerful than before. So I think that was also an underlying. So they started to drive, big banks and big multinational corporations and pharmaceutical companies started to write the laws of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and so forth. So that's a very definite change in terms of sort of who became powerful after now, whether it's ideas that drove, ideas that enabled them, that legitimized their actions, or it was because these groups were already becoming very powerful and they could leverage the right ideas. So there's a kind of a chicken and egg kind of a story. But I think it was both.
Thank you. Professor Kunal Sen, please.
Professor Rodrik Kunal Sen, UNU Wider, Helsinki, Finland. I had a question on the varieties of capitalism. So if you look at East Asia's capitalism has pretty much followed what we saw in the West, right? So workers moving from agriculture to productive manufacturing, to productive services, the informal sector slowly contracting, moving away from self-employment to wage employment, and then, of course, over time, strong welfare states. But if we see what's happening in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, we see a different capitalism, a capitalism where workers are moving from agriculture to unproductive services, missing manufacturing in many cases, and weak welfare states, and very high levels of informality, which is clearly quite not going to go reduce over time. So my question is that, one, why are we seeing a different kind of capitalism in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa compared to East Asia? Is it to do with the nature of globalization? Is it the nature of technological change, labor-saving technological change? Or is it just weak institutions and weak state capacity? And the other related question is, what is the future of capitalism in the global South if this is the kind of capitalism we're going to see or increasingly over time?
Yeah, big questions. I don't think I have a very good answer, particularly the one about the future. But I think with regard to sort of the main difference between the Western and to some extent the East Asian model and what we're seeing now in South Asia and Africa is, I mean, the key thing that sort of, the key thing is the missing, organized labor force, organized labor movement. Like, I mean, the South Korean transition to democracy, right, was driven by student movement allied with the organized labor movement. Now, one thing that happens when you don't have a powerful industrialization is you don't get an organized labor movement, right? I mean, that's sort of, if you look at the sketch of Western political development, right? You have a process of industrialization that creates an urban working class, the working class organized in terms of labor movements and political parties that represent them. And they ask for rights. First is for the right to vote, then is for social rights, and then you get the welfare state. So that's the kind of, it's really driven by the expansion of an organized labor movement. Now, you don't have industrialization, you don't have a labor movement. It's really as simple as that. And we now see the reverse of that in the advanced countries because of deindustrialization, disappearance of the labor movement, disappearance, the weakening of labor trade unions. The left has completely collapsed. And rather than asking for sort of expansion of social rights, more inclusive, economically more inclusive societies, parties of the left have now become spokespeople for the educated cognitive elite, and essentially advancing an agenda of social liberalism rather than an agenda of economic inclusion and more sort of the diffusion of productive opportunities throughout society. So they have stopped being. So I think so. You see the late stages of that, but those are societies that are already industrialized and became post-industrial. But if in South Asia or in low-income Africa or many parts in Latin America, you don't have that organized labor movement, then that path is not going to take place. So that creates a very different kinds of politics, I think, and it creates a kind of makes it much more incumbent on political leaderships and political parties to be able to devise new coalitions that are progressive, that are for sort of dissemination of productive opportunity, that are inclusive, but are not based on essentially rooted in organized labor. And when there is organized labor, as you well know, it too often it becomes a kind of a very narrow base, arguing for their own very narrow interests. So it doesn't serve that inclusive end either. So it's a conundrum. I think, just like, the analog, the political analog of my point that we need different development and growth strategies today because of premature deindustrialization and industrialization losing its force as a mechanism for absorbing labor into higher productivity activities. The political analog of that is that we need a new kind of a political party, new political movements that are going to be able to fashion new coalitions. Now, those coalitions might be between, earlier I was talking about the kind of industrial policy that we need with engaging the private sector in productivity enhancing, capability enhancing investments that are also friendly to job creation, employment creation. And maybe that's the domain where you sort of the group of small, medium-sized firms, the part of informal enterprises that are more entrepreneurial, that are ready and willing to make that transition, to make that jump. Maybe that's the new base, but you need to provide them with the kind of services, and that's sort of maybe what this new political movement could be based on that kind of an industrial policy.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. We have a few questions, comments in the chat box. I'll request you to quickly respond to that. Maybe I can just read out for you. Dr. Bushra Yasmin from Pakistan, she wrote, "Sir, with reference to your book on economic rules and globalization paradox, how the economic modeling is going to evolve after this pandemic, especially when researchers have been using globalization KOF index very comfortably as exogenous variables in the models." So that is one question. And then I can see questions from Dr. Somesh Mathur on fourth industrial revolution and technologies. Similarly, question by Dr. I think Anurag Anand also talking about world system is undergoing a major technological change in terms of this fourth industrial revolution. I think his question is how all these sectors are however, all these sectors are highly knowledgeable, highly knowledge and technology intensive. In this scenario, how the developing nations of the global south can provide sustained employment as well as growth. So his question is actually about this fourth industrial revolution and this employment and growth. And then I can see one question from, if you allow me, from Preeti Bhogal, since she's saying, since it is difficult for countries to decouple from China, especially in the case of pharmaceuticals, what do you think are alternative mechanisms? Which countries could replace China in the pharma supply chains? So I'll stop by mentioning another question by Muhammad Wahid Alam. He asked about whether to help countries to fight the adverse economic effects of COVID-19, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank have unfolded their assistance to many countries. Bangladesh has already received a considerable amount from this institution. Do you think that such assistance would exacerbate the possibility of debt trap of developing countries? So I think his question about this debt trap and related to that debt GDP ratio. So I will stop here. I have many questions, and I know that Professor Rehman Sovan, probably he's also here with us. So I also request him to speak after you respond to this questions in the chat box. Over to you.
Thank you, Salim. Lots of questions. So and then we're running out of time. So we just be very brief. On debt, I don't think the IMF and the international lending community, multilateral organizations have done nearly enough. I think this is a big issue. We need much more, but that would be a whole new conversation. So the short answer is there's a lot more to be done. On pharma and China, I think there's a lot of countries actually with some good pharmaceutical capacity. Obviously, India is one. There are even African countries. Some. So there, it's not technically very difficult for countries to get into pharmaceuticals, and so I think diversifying supplies should not be that difficult for in most pharmaceuticals. The question about the employment and versus the capital and skill intensive nature of technological change today, I think this is a fundamental question, and I think there's a I think we need to, unfortunately, this is a question that the advanced countries have to address, because most new technologies are being developed in the West, in the US, Europe, and of course, to some extent, also increasingly in China as well. So I don't think this is really going to change much. I do think even for their own domestic interests, I think countries like US and Europe, and I've been arguing for this now for some time, they have to redirect technological change in ways that are more friendly to labor. But even if that happens, I think that's still going to leave a very big divide between the kinds of technologies or the techniques, production techniques that low-income countries need and what will be available to them. So this is my central source of skepticism, why essentially a path of development that is driven by integration into global markets, that seeks integration into global supply chains, really is going to solve the employment problem for countries like Bangladesh, because pursuing that strategy means, by and large, you're absorbing technologies that are very similar in terms of capital labor ratios, employment requirements. At the margin, there'll be some difference, but not hugely. That's not going to answer the employment and job requirements of countries like Bangladesh. So that's why I end up saying that most of it is going to be in services, employment. That's where it's going to be generated, in services, which are fundamentally much more labor intensive. So that's where I think the focus will increasingly have to be. How are economic models? Are they going to be changing? I'm actually that's the first question now. I'm referring to my book, Economics Rules and the Globalization Paradox. I'm generally, at least in the United States and Europe, I think there's been significant transformation in the way that the economics profession now works. There's, the ideas have been really moving quite rapidly. I mean, to think that today, there's much greater consensus in favor of regulation, of antitrust, much stronger competition policy, much more support for progressive taxation, wealth tax, much more support for higher minimum wages, increasing support for labor unions. So the ideas have really been changing quite rapidly in the economics profession. And I think it's partly because the economics has become much more empirical. So I think, the world confronts you with certain realities that you have to deal with. And I think, you can't just, take refuge behind, preconceived theories of well-functioning markets and so forth. So I think that change has been happening. And I hope it's also the case in the developing world.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. We are very much towards the end of the program, but I would like to take one or two more intervention. One is Dr. Saimahat Bidisha. I think you'd like to pose your question, please. And then we'll go to Professor Rehman Sohan, and then we'll close the session. Please.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Rodrik. I was just wondering, in the countries like Bangladesh, we have digital divide and we have gender divide in education, in skill content, and there is also a huge skill mismatch. So we have youth who are like unemployed but educated. In that case, when we are talking about like policies or focusing on investment, creating job in large scale industries, where there is also the issue of like institutional weaknesses, whether that will help us in achieving our prime goal, like the goals like inclusive growth that we are talking in Bangladesh. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very very good and important point. I think, often, the reason that there, sort of, the one, some young people might be well educated, but not actually may lack the skills that the enterprises need. So I think a lot of the skills that enterprises need have to do with, might have to do with very specific skills, and there might be soft skills that necessarily that aren't taught in high school or in colleges. So I think, where skills programs work best and training programs work best are places where skills provider or educational institutions are very closely linked with the employers. So they know what their requirements are, whether they're hard skills or soft skills, so that they invest in the right kinds of training. So I think making that connection in the education and training system, or the vocational training system, with the needs of employers, current and prospective, that I think is the key institutional challenge in making the training skills system work well.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. I will now finally go to Professor Raymond Sovan. Sir, if you are with us.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Oh, okay.
So if you'd like to turn your video on. Yes, sir, we can see
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Dani. It's a long time since I've heard you in person. And as usual, you stimulate and get us to think out of the box. I think in the short time, I will just leave two thoughts with you. One, of course, is that you, in fact, mentioned, but not as loudly as presumably you have mentioned in the past and you've written about. That's very central to this is the critical role which the state is going to play in the way in which it then really interfaces with the market. And we have been through almost sort of now 2 to 3 decades of an essentially market-driven process, which in fact has created these structural problems which we have now picked up, which are now going to sort of condition the way in which we respond to the new trends. But what you have in fact been telling us is that if you have a much more purposefully engaged state, which takes into account the problems you've identified, for example, the need for building up a strong domestic capacity, particularly for large population countries such as Bangladesh, then it isn't simply enough for leaving these to market forces to work themselves out and simply pumping credit into the market in the belief that this will really solve the problem. You need a much more purposefully oriented state, which has incentives which can, in fact, stimulate small and medium entrepreneurs and can get them plugged into value chains, both into the larger production sectors as also into the global market. Now, these were areas which the Japanese, the East Asians, and of course now more recently the Chinese have done much more effectively. And this has virtually gone off the development market in virtually most countries and certainly across all of South Asia. So here, obviously, I don't know how much more you've written about this, but what would be the ways in which you would need to get a more purposefully oriented state to get on to the job, because
I'm not sure whether we lost Professor Sovan here in the connection. We'll just wait for a few seconds.
Maybe I can just comment
yes,
a little bit.
I think so.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think what Professor Soban was talking about is very important. I think there's two dimensions of this. One is of the purposeful and effective state. One is the point about purpose, having a good sense of strategy, having a good sense of what is the project, what is it that it's trying to achieve. And the other is its ability to achieve that, its capacity of actually doing that. I think they're both important, and they sort of follow. They're closely connected. That a state or a government that has a good sense of what its priorities are and what its objectives are is much more likely to develop the instruments that can achieve those objectives. So number one is having a good sense of what is it that it's trying to do. I mean, the example I always give is, it's remarkable how in the last 30 years or so, countries have developed the capacity to run very complicated monetary and inflation targeting regimes, because reducing inflation became, and this is some very low income countries, once monetary stability became an objective, then suddenly central banks became independent. Inflation targeting regimes began to be. So there was a lot of capacity was built off the back of having very clear priorities. The second thing I would say is that capacity. I think state capacity is something that one does not inherit. I mean, it's not a question of you can't do this because you don't have the state capacity. It's you build the capacity over time. So it's always a question of sort of engaging in these kinds of activities and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and capacity is something that's sort of built over that process once you have a well-defined objective.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik. I think time is up, and I personally think that the discussion and your presentation and the follow discussion was so engaging, so interesting, so provocative and thought-provoking. So we are so fortunate to have you with us in this conference, and I'm quite sure that the participants, they gained a lot, and actually many of the participants are young participants, young researchers from South Asia, and I think they were looking forward to it, to see you and to see your presentation. Thank you so much. And I also thank all the participants for being with us. I know it's already late in some places, but thank you for being with us and giving us all the kind of support to organize this conference. So Professor Rodrik, if you have any kind of final few words for us, and then we'll close the session with your words. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Selim, for giving me the opportunity. I note that Professor Rahman Sobhani has rejoined us. Sorry that I was elaborating on the question that we were talking about in terms of the purposeful state, which is very important. Unfortunately, you were not. I don't think you could listen at the time, but I appreciate your presence and your comment. It's very good to see you, Professor Sobhan. And thanks to everybody else for the questions, for the participation, and hope to be with you again, perhaps in person sometime soon.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik, and we also look forward to seeing you in person and seeing you in South Asia. So that will be really great. So with this, I'd like to conclude this session, and I welcome you to come to the next session tomorrow. Our first session will start at 2:30 p.m. Bangladesh time. So welcome to the second day of the conference. And with this, I would like to conclude this session. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sir, Ramaswan sir, I think the connection was lost. We're extremely sorry that because of the time constant, we had to close this session, and we could not hear your last few words.